I've described how I wrote my most recent book, Perspective and Guidance for a Time of Deep Discord, because of great concern I feel about how, with issues of every sort today, people are dividing almost immediately into polar camps. Extreme polarization is setting neighbor against neighbor, creating distraction that gets in the way of addressing essential questions and often very directly putting us at risk. After addressing causes with each chapter in the book, I illustrate how we can bring culturally mature perspective to one issue where divisiveness too often prevails. I chose the concerns I did because each has something particular to teach us about addressing issues more systemically. The immigration question brings us back to episode 10's essential recognition that culturally mature decision making requires that we be highly attentive to context. It also reminds us the importance of understanding identity in more systemic ways. In this case, as with episode number 18's look at War and Peace, collective identity. And in particular, it highlights the dynamic role of boundaries in the workings of living systems. I've noted that a basic observation provides the architecture for the book. In times past, when we encountered polarized positions and partisan advocacy, the task was obvious and unquestioned. We assumed that there were only two options and that our job was to figure out which one was right and fight for it. As we look to the future, polarization has very different implications. We recognize that what we are seeing as left and right hands of a larger systemic picture. The fact of polarization also alerts us to the fact that neither side has yet to ask the larger question that ultimately needs to be addressed. Immigration policy is another area where conversation today increasingly becomes contentious and polarized. At the populist extremes, assertions can be made that are really quite ludicrous. On the extreme right, we find an ethno-nationalism that essentially objects to immigration of any sort. Build that wall. On the extreme left, we encounter views that can come close to suggesting that having borders at all is morally wrong. Often the result is not just confusion, but the perpetration of real harm, and on both sides. From the right, short-sighted exclusionist policies do damage to those who might seek to immigrate. Such policies also often do harm to countries that might be rewarded with the kinds of contributions immigrant populations have traditionally made to their new homes. From the left, we find stances that can get in the way of thinking about border policy with the complexity needed for policy that effectively benefits with us. We also find that those who assert that borders are important being reflexively labeled as racist. While bigotry can play a role when borders are emphasized, with the best of such views, that is not the case. I won't here address the specifics of immigration policy. That is beyond our scope and also beyond my expertise. Rather, I'm interested in the values and ways of understanding needed to produce the best policy decisions. Whatever kind of policy might be most appropriate in a particular situation, the basic observation that we need to bring greater sophistication to how we make immigration-related determinations is valid and important. As a way in, let me share an experience that has prompted me to think more deeply about the immigration question. Several years back, a valued colleague in England contacted me after reading an article I had written on immigration policy. He angrily challenged me that the article had an unacknowledged liberal bias. While historically had been liberal in his views, he had been a supporter of Great Britain separating from the European Union. A main reason was that he felt that the European Union had been unwilling to limit immigration in ways necessary to the health of his country. The fact that he had often felt denigrated and misunderstood for his position was part of what had motivated him to get in touch. I was fascinated to compare our experiences. Immigration is central to the American story. We are a country of immigrants. And the influence of immigration in my home state of Washington has been almost wholly positive. That doesn't mean we haven't had controversy, but we would not have a thriving Apple industry in the state, or more recently, a vital high-tech industry, if it were not for immigration, with much of it historically illegal. In contrast, my colleague lived in a part of London that had become largely immigrant. It felt to him that too often new immigrants were antagonistic to their new home and at the extreme interested in doing harm to it. I don't think it is appropriate to assume that the job of newcomers is simply to assimilate. Immigrants have always brought with them new colors and flavors of experience and transformed their new homelands in the process. But my colleague is an extremely intelligent and open-minded person and far from a bigot. I could understand how he might conclude, given current world circumstances, that the right response would be to revisit existing immigration policies. A conversation prompted me to think more complexly than I had previously about the immigration question, and particularly to better appreciate the importance of being attentive to context. It also alerted me to how the immigration debate was another concern where a willingness to ask a larger kind of question and bring culturally mature perspective to bear would be important. As with the abortion debate, with immigration we encounter competing goods, in this case protection and tradition on one hand and freedom and opportunity on the other. The needed larger question once again comes back to the choices that will be needed that will be most ultimately life-affirming. But here it concerns how we best support the life vitality of social systems and nations, and in particular the role of boundaries in doing so. I find four recognitions key if we are to get beyond polarized debate and address immigration in terms of this more encompassing questions. None of them is ultimately complicated, but each requires more systemic perspective if it is to be effectively applied or even fully grasped. First, we need to think more consciously about immigration policy. The need to make immigration-related determinations has always been part of having borders, but in times past, basic policy assumptions were closely tied to culture's parental authority and absolutist cultural truths. Answering immigration questions wisely is another part of our new shared responsibility. Second, we need to conceive of borders more complexly and dynamically. I often draw on the metaphor of a cell to get at what more is required. Cells are alive because they have boundaries, cell membranes. Without a cell membrane, the cell would die. But to complete this recognition and the metaphor, we also need to appreciate that it is just as much the case that the cell would die if the membrane is only a wall. We need to include a critical additional property. Cell membranes are semi-permeable. Cells are most vital when the balance between the cell membrane's permeability and impermeability is just right. Similarly, societies are most vital and creative when the balance between boundary yeses and nos is determined correctly. The third recognition is illustrated by the conversation with my English colleague. The right kind of border policy may be very different depending on the context. If we are to make right boundary policy, we must learn both to better tease apart how different contexts are different and more effectively understand how various contexts may call for different kinds of policies. And a fourth kind of recognition is also important if boundary-related conversations are to be productive. Different people, by virtue of their makeup, are going to be more attuned to the permeability or impermeability aspects of any kind of boundary. People who think of themselves as liberals are most likely to identify with the permeability aspect of semi-permeability. Openness is an important value. People who think of themselves as conservative are most likely to identify with the exclusionary aspect of semi-permeability. They find particular importance in safety and in bonds with family and community. While they also value openness, it is openness within those bonds that are important to them. Such openness requires vigilance with regard to just who gets let in. If our border-related debates are to be at all civil, and certainly if they are to result in effective policy, we need to appreciate how the positions of each side reflect an important kind of needed understanding. It is important to fully grasp the newness of what these recognitions ask of us. The needed new skills and capacities that I outlined in previous episodes provide perspective. Certainly being this conscious and responsible in how we think about borders is new. So is thinking in ways that are this multifaceted and dynamic, that require, as we've seen with other topics, that we be more comfortable with complexity and uncertainty. Again, we also, in new ways, encounter limits, certainly to ways of thinking that make immigration only negative or positive. And again, too, if we aren't accustomed to reflecting this deeply on context. That includes what is true and how what is true in one situation can be so different from what is true in another. It also includes being attentive to differences in viewpoint, and in particular, ways that such differences can benefit us. We can again think in terms of no's and yeses to each side. The no to the right is that immigrants need not be a threat. The yes is that if immigration is to add to our collective lives, we cannot shy away from the importance of having strong borders. The no to the left is that ignoring distinctions that need to be made only denies an essential kind of responsibility. The yes to the left is that when we accept the importance of this responsibility, immigration can be a powerfully positive force. Author and columnist Thomas Friedman has put it succinctly in speaking of the need for high walls with a big gate. National boundaries could easily seem a rather abstract concern for many people, or at least a kind of concern that seems better left to formal policymakers. To appreciate the common sense nature of how integrative meta-perspective alters our relationship to boundaries, it could help to recognize that the same kind of greater boundary sophistication that I've described between nations also becomes newly important with boundary relationships between every other kind of human system. For example, in episode number 13, I described how cultural maturity's changes make it possible to love in more complete ways. Such more whole person love, as with whole system relationships between nations, requires that we be newly conscious of boundaries. In times past, clear cultural dictates about dating, love, marriage, and parenting made the larger portion of relational boundary decisions for us. Whole person love also requires us to be responsible in a world where relational yeses and nos appropriately take a greater variety of forms and often more dynamic and multifaceted forms. We see related changes with relationships of all kinds. Friendship in a culturally mature world similarly requires that we hold relational yeses and nos more dynamically and systemically. More traditionally, we might have thought of friends as people who will always have our backs and contrasted that with enemies. In a culturally mature reality, we leave behind the two halves makes a whole mythologized kind of reality. I can count on my best friends not just to call me out if they think I'm wrong, but also to simply be who they are in my presence. We see something similar in relationships between culturally mature organizations. With human systems of all scales, we are needing to more consciously hold them as systems and also to engage other systems as whole systems. The way this more encompassing picture brings together the more whole person, whole system nature of culturally mature identity, the importance of understanding boundaries more complexly, and how relationships are changing in our times, helps summarize the new task with immigration. Cultural maturity makes immigration question about conceiving of a collective identity in the most complete and life-affirming ways. Put another way, it challenges us to base our boundary decisions on the choices that are most consistent with ultimate benefit, on the degree to which at particular times and places boundaries best support societies as living systems. This section's further reflections simply add that both identity and the most life-affirming boundary decisions are always, in the end, also about relationship. All of them might seem terribly complicated, but in fact it proves great illustration of the apparent paradox that brings these various episodes together. Hold reality large enough, and what I've described comes to seem rather common sense. Again, I invite your thoughts and questions.